It's the week ending Saturday the 9th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen British politicians debating how to stop knife crime after incidents leap by 93% in 5 years. Fans of Michael Jackson protesting outside Channel 4 as the broadcaster airs a new expose, and Forbes named Kylie Jenner as the world's youngest self-made billionaire. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. The big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And with Hollie away, joining me from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Kari, Wilkin and Hollie Clemence. And to start the show this week, it is actually you, Hollie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think it's all about me, myself and I.
You look like you had a great, fun day.
It was a fabulous day.
And is it going well with yourself?
It's going really well. I'm still in the honeymoon period, I think.
So you haven't had a row with yourself yet or anything? Or?
You know, there's always ups and downs, but for better or worse, I think, you know, it's a daily sort of climb, really.
Mm-hmm. And Sophie, what happens if you ever meet someone else? Will you have to divorce yourself?
Well, so I think divorcing yourself is quite harsh because it's quite a journey to get there to marrying myself. And divorcing yourself means that you couldn't live with yourself, which is not a great place to be.
No,
so,
tricky place to be.
Yeah, tricky.
That was Sophie Tanner speaking on ITV's This Morning back in June 2016. Hollie, what's happened more recently?
So the Metro has interviewed another lady, this lady's from New York, called Gia Vitale, who says she's autosexual. She also wants to marry herself. And it sparked debate among several newspapers. Breitbart predictably slammed it, saying it's the logical conclusion of the most narcissistic generation.
I mean, relationship counsellors and self-help gurus have long espoused the idea that love for others begins with oneself. Is that not what this is all about, actually?
I quite like that idea, and I think some people who have married themselves, they've had a tough time with a relationship with a man, and they've thought this is kind of a way to show how much I do love myself. You've got the Carrie Bradshaw kind of talks about it in Sex and the City, it's that kind of view. But then there's also autosexual, which I think is more about finding yourself sexually attractive, which is quite different.
Yeah, so it's kind of love versus romantic love versus attraction.
Literally, you look in the mirror and you find yourself attractive. I think the term was coined as a medical term for you only want to have sex with yourself rather than other people. But there's this auto-romance, which means you kind of in love with yourself, which is more than loving yourself, I think. You're literally in love with yourself. You get butterflies thinking about yourself, which I just can't imagine.
No, I mean, this is something that literature for decades, if not hundreds of years, has been warning against, the idea of the follies of self-love. I mean, Kari, you know, what is the actual problem with being attracted to yourself?
I think part of the difficulty with this whole debate is that there's just a lack of consensus really about exactly what autosexuality means. Some say it's just falling in love with yourself, you know, at which point it's where do you draw that line between narcissism, between, you know, healthy self-love. Others say that has to be the sexual, physical self-love, and, you know, some argue you therefore can't be attracted to other people, whereas others argue that you can fancy yourself and fancy other people.
I think any time a new sexuality comes to the fore and is being speculated upon, there is a sort of reaction against it, right? So,
yeah, I mean, Sophie Tanner, the woman we heard earlier, she actually talks about relationship anarchy, where she's saying, you know, part of this is just sort of, it's about trying to throw off this stigma of singledom. So it's about you refusing to be pigeonholed in these slots.
I think that's quite telling that it's a lot of women, they call it sologamy, women marrying themselves more than men.
Yeah.
And I think it is this kind of spinster stereotype that they're trying to cast off, and their mothers and grandmothers will have always been growing up in this age where you're supposed to get married to a man and that's what it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be on your own. But I think they're just throwing that to the wind.
I mean, it sounds outlandish, but I think it does tap into kind of a long tradition. You know, you've got, you know, Tracy Emin marrying a rock. You've got, you know, going back to political lesbianism in the 70s. And like Hollie was saying, it mostly kind of a female-dominated way of breaking free of all these traditional patterns. But, I mean, obviously, autosexuality does go beyond that. And that's where I find it a confusing concept.
I think the arguments got sort of confused between women who are using this to make a statement and women who just really fancy themselves.
So I guess my question is, like, if you were turned on by yourself, how would you ever get anything done?
How would you get anything done when you're with your boyfriend or husband, for example?
And maybe that's the legitimate question, that this is sort of a building block for other relationships, that a lot of people think that you start with self-love and then from there you can start to build other kinds of relationships. But does anyone actually know anyone who has that trait of autosexuality?
I don't want to name names, but I do know someone who masturbates in a mirror.
Oh, please, name names.
Can you imagine? No, I will preserve their identity. But I just want to make it clear, it isn't me.
Okay. I have a friend.
Yeah, this
but
friend of mine.
isn't that a completely separate thing? I'm sure I read something that is defined as a completely different form of sexuality. Again, it's such a fluid area, as it were.
Come on.
It's very difficult to say, well, that is autosexuality. Is that not just perhaps one characteristic of it? But then you could say,
are you being turned on by the idea of masturbating in a mirror, or are you being turned on by wow, I'm so good looking?
Yeah.
And I think that's right, that on one level you can look at it as a sexual thing that people experience, but on another level, and I read a relationship counsellor talking about this, autosexuality is partly about just being comfortable in one's own skin, as it were. Is that not what we're talking about, really?
I think that's partly what this lady in the metro is talking about. She's got great quotes. I mean, she says she goes on dates with herself. She says, I can take myself out for coffee, go on walks in nature, dress in lingerie and cuddle up to myself, or simply sit in the darkness and bask in my own presence.
It's so convenient.
Sometimes she lights candles and does sensual dances for her own entertainment. If I was entertained by myself that much, I mean, how great would your life be?
But aside from the doing sensual dances, is that not stuff we all do anyway?
Oh!
No, but what I mean is, do you not have, scented candles, in the bath on your own? Is that not just me? Is that not just a definition of me time?
I'm not personally turned on by that, though.
Oh no, sorry.
It's nice.
Is she saying that turns her on?
I think so, like a date with
I thought she was just talking
might.
about relaxing. I mean, is that not just relaxing?
The thing is,
yeah.
I think despite the fact that, obviously we have come a long way in terms of how we view relationships in society and, women's place in society, there is still something slightly revolutionary about a woman emphasising how she can be content alone and have a kind of a fulfilling, rich life without a companion.
And you should say, this obviously isn't just a female thing. It's autosexuality can be male or female, so it's not limited to one gender or the other. But you're right, the way that it's being speculated about is largely being spoken about by women talking about their own experience.
Surely this is a bit like drinking, for example. You can either drink to drown your sorrows or to sort of enjoy the highs. And is it not the same with this, that you can be celebrating yourself or you're sort of spiraling into a defensive form of self-preservation, sort of almost building barriers, saying, I only need me? Isn't it just all about your attitude to how you do this?
Or is it a legitimate new thing and in 10 years we'll all be married to ourselves? One or the other. Next up, it's Rebecca after this. So, Rebecca, it's your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Do schools need to introduce lessons in speaking slowly and loudly?
Je suis la jeune fille. Je suis le garçon.
Yes, that's French they're speaking. And no, these children aren't French. They're British. And they've acquired their amazing new language skills from Muzzy, the remarkable video language program for children developed by the BBC, a world leader in language instruction, and now available to you from Early Advantage. What a thrilling gift to give your children, a second language. And in today's competitive world, what a wonderful advantage in their school years and in all the years that follow.
That was a commercial for Muzzy, the BBC's language learning cartoon from back in 1996. Rebecca, you're multilingual. Can you please tell us in French what the story is here?
I don't know that would be very fair to our general listenership.
Okay, do it in English.
So there's been two main stories this week. They're both about language learning in the UK and the kind of dire straits that they're in. The first was a cross-parliamentary committee report that found that basically we're in a bit of a disastrous downturn of language learning. Fewer pupils are studying languages and fewer adults are able to speak them as a consequence, and it's putting Britain at a disadvantage, they've warned, and we need to drastically change the situation to turn this around. And then also a survey of the Sixth Form Colleges Association that they did on school leaders found that more than half of sixth forms had cut at least one language A level as a result of dwindling uptake and budget pressures.
And so is this a story of a lack of demand, or is it something else that's going on here?
It is rooted in a lack of demand, but of course that in itself is rooted in the fact that languages, I think, have not been valued or promoted enough. You can't really expect children to necessarily make that decision for themselves. In lots of other countries, they don't make that decision. You know, language learning is compulsory throughout the whole of school life. I think languages are often seen as a more difficult subject, and so given the choice, a lot of pupils won't necessarily pick them up. Until 2002, it was compulsory to study at least one language to GCSE, but since that's dropped, the percentage of pupils who do take a language for GCSE has dropped from about 75% down to about 40-something%. It's higher in private schools and grammar schools and much lower in state schools.
I mean, Kari, we've spoken in the past about how syllabus writing requires hard decisions to be made. You're always weighing up some subjects against others. Is it really important to keep languages being taught versus the importance of other subjects?
I think it is. Yeah, there was a report last June that found that more than a third of all state schools now allow pupils to opt out of studying a language in year 9 when they're 13 or 14. And given that most kids in England or in Britain don't start learning a language until they're 11, you're not going to pick up a great deal in 2 years. I think this encapsulates, as Rebecca says, this whole attitude that very outdated attitude of, oh, you know, we speak English, so why do we need to learn a foreign language? But in fact, 75% of the world's population does not speak English. But I think it goes beyond that also, that I think learning a foreign language helps you better understand your own language. You actually begin to understand the building blocks of language and how it all fits together. So I think we're losing out massively, and I do think it should be, learning foreign languages should be regarded as central to the syllabus as, you know, the sciences.
But at the same time, English is obviously, ironically enough, the lingua franca internationally. You know, that this is the language that more people speak than any other language as a second language. So, you know, one of the things that Baroness Jean Cousins said, who co-chaired the group that wrote this report, said was that speaking only English is as much as a disadvantage as speaking no English at all. But is that really the case, Hollie?
I think there have been studies that show if you're in a room full of people where English is your mother tongue, people struggle to understand you if it's not theirs, whereas if you've learnt English as a second language, you're better able to pronounce things because you've learnt it rather than you've just grown up saying it. But I think it, like Kari says, it affects other things, science, maths, there's all sorts of subjects that it affects whether you speak languages or not. In Spain, they've introduced 2 languages as part of going through school. They're bilingual, and they saw an uptick in all their grades across the spectrum, which is quite telling. I'm sadly one of the 53% of UK adults that regret not making the most of their languges. I did GCSE French, but my mum bought me Muzzy and I watched the English version and ignored the French.
Still no joy. still can't do it.
The only reason I did it as GCSE was because it was compulsory, but I'm glad in a way I've got a little bit of French. And I just think we need to go back to it being compulsory.
And that's one thing, is that it needs to be taught earlier. As Kari was saying, a lot of people only start learning languages when they're 11 and then they have the option to give it up at 13. But, you know, studies have shown that the earlier you start, the easier it is and the more you absorb. And as Hollie was just touching on, it does have cognitive benefits. It engages your brain in a way that makes it easier for you to learn other subjects as well. So it does have an all-round benefit. But I think the major obstacle we have, and Arion, you kind of touched on this a minute ago, is that we don't really have a natural language to gravitate to in the way that other countries start English language teaching in schools. You know, that's like that's the most obvious and useful language for pupils to learn in other countries. But whereas for us, you know, we've got traditional ones like French, German, Spanish, but there's no particular reason that we should be teaching those above Chinese, Arabic, Russian, etc.
And really the major reduction that we're seeing here is in French and German, and you could argue that actually what's essential here is picking up other languages, particularly Chinese. There's a big push towards that. Isn't that the direction that things should be going?
I think it's unfortunate that Chinese is such a particularly hard, you know, difficult language, because you've got to learn a whole new form of writing as well. So it's. I lived in Japan for a year, and I sort of went in there very blithely thinking, oh, you know, I'll pick this up in no time. You can pick up the spoken side, but I was told the average Japanese person, their reading isn't good enough to really be able to properly understand read a newspaper until they're about 18. So what chance does an English person stand?
What about the question of age then? Because New Labour shifted the focus and the funding away from secondary language education back towards primary. Is it, I mean, has that worked? And do you have to get kids young, particularly to pick up things like, reading of Japanese, which is a complicated thing that's going to take a long time?
Chinese is even harder.
I think you can see the one of the things that really amuses me, rewatching that Muzzy advert, I mean, that was on all the time when I was a kid, is the way that the language learning, they're not French, they're British. The fact that these children can speak one sentence each of a foreign language is being treated as slightly miraculous and magical. Oh, yeah. And I think that's the result of the fact that we aren't taught if we were taught from the age of 5, people would not think it was this amazing, intimidating accomplishment to be able to speak a foreign language.
A former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, came out and spoke some Mandarin at a conference. People were like, this is incredible. He speaks Chinese. Astonishing.
I think these it's almost as though we've convinced ourselves that we're just simply not, as Rebecca was saying, that we're simply not capable of learning foreign languages as a nation. The European Commission, they did this survey. The UK came out the worst in the whole of Europe for learning foreign languages, and I think it becomes a vicious cycle. It's just, oh no, we can't do it.
But of course, school isn't the only place where you pick up a language, and actually most of my international friends who speak English have learnt it because they've been consuming media, they've been watching TV shows and listening to English music. Is that not the place, Hollie, that we need to see more education being given to kids?
Yeah, I think as adults, maybe that is the point when you go back and realise that you should. Both my parents do French lessons, incidentally, and they're both retired now, so that's obviously a time when everyone wants to pick up their language. But there are things, there's language learning with Netflix, which is this new Chrome extension that loads of people have started using in the last few weeks, where you can read subtitles on Netflix while you're watching a foreign film. I'm not convinced that's the only way to learn a language. I think you probably need some help as well, maybe in a class. But there are other ways around it if you decide to do it as an adult. But I guess, like Rebecca says, it's having that motivation. Like, if I learned French, I'd feel like I'd need to go to France to use it. Otherwise, unless you know other people that you're going to be using that language with, it feels like you're not going to get the chance to kind of use your talents.
I mean, is that what this is about? That the UK is retreating from Europe particularly, and so those European languages just aren't as sort of foremost in people's minds? Is that what's going on here? I
think the optics of it, as these reports coming out so close to Brexit Day, are not optimal. And Baroness Cousins said that she's particularly highlighted the fact that we've got all these trade negotiations and that this is becoming a problem. As we embark on all these we're trying to form all these new deals with European nations, like our lack of language prowess is an obstacle to the country, and it does have an economic effect as well, obviously, on foreign investment into the UK, etc. Having a broad base of people in this country with those foreign language skills is a boon to the economy, and so we will be at a disadvantage without that.
And conversely, isn't Brexit going to make it worse? Kids are going to sort of go, well, we're not even part of Europe anymore. Why do I need to learn languages? You're going to lose the teachers who are here who don't have UK citizenship. Exchange schemes are presumably going to be harder to arrange. It's only going to make it worse unless we actually take action to tackle it.
I think there's a paradox already, like you say, of schools reporting that children aren't motivated because their parents have been telling them, we're okay now, we're just going to be UK, you never have to talk again to anyone outside of the UK.
And Brexit also has a massive logistical impact on delivering language teaching in schools, because a large proportion of language teachers are from EU member states. And the Sixth Form Colleges Association report found that a lot of school leaders were concerned that they had large numbers of staff leaving, and it was difficult to recruit new staff. And as someone who I did 2 languages throughout school, and it is much harder when you have an English native speaker teaching you those languages, like you do even as like a 15, 16-year-old. There are times you think, no, wait, I don't think that's right. It's never going to be the same. So I think that the Brexit is going to have an impact on that side as well.
Well, as we contemplate that depressing idea of only talking to ourselves for the rest of time, we've got one last story to come after this. And so finally this week, it's Kari. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think this is the week we ask, is this the end of AIDS?
All right, a stunning new report that will be unveiled this afternoon is giving new hope in the battle against one of the world's biggest challenges, HIV. This is a major breakthrough. Doctors revealed that an HIV-positive man has become the second known adult in the world to be cleared of the virus. He received a bone marrow transplant from an HIV-resistant donor and is now in long-term remission. This marks a huge step in the medical field toward finding a cure for the virus, one that had sparked a global health crisis predating the 1980s.
That was MSNBC's Ali Velshi reporting on the 5th of March on what he called a major breakthrough in HIV. Kari, first of all, is this a major breakthrough?
It's a significant breakthrough, but I think we need to be very wary of touting this as that there is an AIDS cure coming. And a lot of scientists are saying, please be very responsible about how you report this. It's a huge step. This man, he had HIV and then he also developed blood cancer. So really a bone marrow transplant was his last hope. And he was giving bone marrow stem cells from a donor with a rare genetic mutation called CCR5 that resists HIV infection. He's the second known person to have survived after and being cleared of HIV after having this specific treatment. So they're both being cleared. They haven't been cured. That's the important distinction. They've been categorized as in remission. And so it's exciting, but it's not a cure. And also the doctors are emphasizing that this procedure is expensive, it's complex, it's risky. You need an exact matched donor from a tiny proportion of people, most of whom are Northern European descent with this mutation. So it's a clue as opposed to a cure. And I think
that's the warning that's being given out generally, that this is a good moment and it's something to celebrate, but actually the question is its scalability. Even so, that glimmer of hope is why you brought this to our attention, right?
It is. It's that glimmer of hope, but also it's about the whole way that we approach infectious diseases. We all, we hate bad things. We want bad things to go away and stay away. So there's all this emphasis on eradicating disease or eliminating diseases. And I think we often confuse what's going on here, because with infectious diseases, you've basically got three different ways of tackling it. You've got elimination, which is to clear a disease from a certain population at a certain point of time. You've got eradication, which is when there's a concerted effort to reduce the worldwide incidence of an infectious disease to zero. And then there's extinction, where you're totally destroying all the disease pathogens and the vectors that can transmit it. And I think the danger is that we mistake eradication for extinction, and that can make us complacent, so that we're therefore not ready in case a disease reoccurs or mutates. It can make us complacent, so that we stop funding it because we think we've reached a point that we haven't. So I think it's just that we need to be very careful about the dangers of trying to eradicate diseases and everything that can ensue as a result.
Yeah, that's a massive question, and we'll come back to that one. But just coming back to HIV as a specific example, in the West, where things like PrEP and antiretroviral drugs are readily available, we can often think that actually HIV has been already brought under control. But the question is, actually there's big fights still to be fought, not just with HIV, and take that as a good example, but with other diseases as well. So the question is, not just with this, but with other treatments and other potential cures, are they going to be scalable, and will we be able to use them around the world?
This specific procedure is definitely not scalable. Wyatt described it as the boutiquiest kind of treatment you could possibly envision. About 1% of people even have this genetic mutation that makes them immune to HIV. So even if every single one of them wanted to donate their bone marrow, it's never going to be used to treat the vast majority of patients with HIV. However, researchers do think that now that we've isolated that this particular gene is basically solely responsible for letting HIV into the body, that we can come up with some treatments that will target this. It's actually, we've had this genetic mutation has been in the news last year. There was a Chinese scientist who illicitly he claims, we haven't seen the proof, but he claims that he gene edited 2 baby girls whose mother was HIV positive to give them this mutation, and it obviously created a huge furore, and he has kind of disappeared from view slightly since this came out. But even though that was a very unethical and irresponsible procedure to perform on embryos, that may be in the future a route that might be a bit more scalable.
And I think that opens up the broader question that Kari is asking here, which is, should we be even looking to cure all diseases, Hollie?
Yes.
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 Yeah, sure. I mean, it sounds intuitively logical, but wait.
On a personal level, obviously, I think people need to be cured of diseases, but I also think it makes sense for society and communities. As we were saying earlier, I think HIV is the vast majority of people suffering are in lower middle income countries. And if they weren't feeling so terrible because they can't even get the medication that often people use to manage it in, say, America and over here in Europe, they'd be more productive for society if they could go out to work each day or concentrate at school or study. But at the moment, they're feeling so terrible and in such a bad way that they can't do that. Whereas if everybody was cured and we had a disease-free world, people could all be more productive.
That's a really heartwarming utilitarian take on disease.
I totally agree with what you're saying about AIDS. But I think with any disease eradication strategies, you just need to be very careful about how you go about it exactly. Malaria is another good example. At the moment, there's a lot of debate about whether an eradication push could work, and there was a similar effort in the 1950s, a global attempt to eradicate malaria by spraying houses with DDT. It didn't work. There was widespread drug resistance and unsustainable funding from donor countries, and the whole project got abandoned, but the result was that it led to the emergence of severe, much more resistant strains that are harder to treat, so it made the problem worse. And now there is another push from agencies, including the Gates Foundation, saying that they want to try this again. They admit it's going to take at least up to 40 years at an annual cost of $5 billion. And obviously, malaria is a terrible disease. We do need to tackle it. But what happens if the funding dries up during those 40 years and we're left with yet another stronger strain? It's just you have to think these things through. We can't play God. We have to be careful about unbalancing nature.
And I suppose when you look back to the early days of how the world tried to grapple with HIV and AIDS back in the 80s and 90s, it was all about prevention rather than the quest for a cure. Now that we've got to a stage where there's sort of an inkling of a cure, should we also be looking back at prevention because that's just an essential part of treating any illness?
I feel like at each stage it's these campaigns have sort of been undermined slightly by human nature because, at first, like you say, it was very prevention focused, don't do this, don't do that, but people will keep exhibiting dangerous behaviours. That's not to say that everyone who contracted HIV, did it, through their own behaviour, but, it's like with the contraceptive pill, if you take it the way you're supposed to, then you almost definitely will not get pregnant, but tons of people still do because they don't take it. So at each stage we're basically, we're just finding the next thing, and eventually we're going to have to get to the cure because, the other solutions, preventative solutions and medication-based solutions don't work en masse because there will always be that percentage of people that don't, follow the rules correctly for one reason or another, which means that the disease will never be eradicated.
But is that not then down? Is there not an argument that we need to get? We've all become a bit complacent about HIV. We know we've got these drugs that can quell it. I think some people think it more or less has been cured. And to begin with, when they first led the campaign to prevent the spread of HIV, the numbers of new infections dropped massively every year, whereas the last couple of years it's remained static at about 1.8 million new HIV infections each year. So there's a certain amount of complacency. It's just there isn't that fear driving people to be careful anymore. Yeah. And I think that's something we need to target.
Okay, so Rebecca, a hypothetical for you. You go on Celebrity Pointless and you win. And at the end, Alexander Armstrong comes out and he asks, which charity would you like to give your money to? But he says, it's not money, it's a cure for a currently incurable disease. Then this curtain flings up and there are people behind the curtain, each with various kinds of incurable diseases.
This is like knowing me, knowing you at the dialysis machine.
Of TV shows.
Wheel it away.
Anyway, which of the possible incurable diseases do you cure? Go.
Oh, I thought you were going to give me a multiple choice.
No, it's up to you completely.
I think I'd have to say Alzheimer's because I'm really selfish and I suspect that by the time we're that age, like everyone will contract it, so it's probably in my interest.
That's a non-infectious disease.
Wait, I thought it was incurable diseases.
Incurable diseases is the rule that
I guess
Armstrong's laid down.
I think Alzheimer's because we're all going to live longer and we're all going to end up with it.
Yep, nice one. Kari?
Cancer. If I can encompass everything.
Yep,
just all cancers.
All cancers, yep. Hollie?
I won't go for one that anyone else has gone for so that we can get rid of 3 in one go. I'll go for malaria because it's widespread and affects young people as well, so obviously they'd have longer to live.
Oh, good teamwork, everybody. Well, that's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, Hollie Clemence and Kari Wilkin. And you can find a cure for your lack of current affairs podcasts that aren't about Brexit when you subscribe to this show, The Week Unwrapped. You can do it now for free on your podcast app of choice. And don't forget that on Sunday the 7th of April, we'll be appearing live as part of the Podcast Live Politics show in central London. Come watch a live recording of The Week Unwrapped and then ask us all the burning questions you've been dying to ask. For tickets, go to podcastlive.com and put in week 10 at checkout for a 10% discount on the ticket price. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer was Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, goodbye.